Black history matters in South Dakota. Now, I'll admit, I know that's a hard sell in a state like ours. I know because I've spent the last few years teaching African American history here, and more recently, I serve as the director of the South Dakota African American History Museum, located in downtown Sioux Falls. African Americans have never made up a large portion of this state's population. In the early 20th century, there were nearly 500 African Americans residing within the state. In the early period, the numbers of African Americans who passed through this state either as enslaved people, spectators, domestic laborers on the ships traveling up and down the Missouri River, or as members of the military, far outnumbered the African Americans who lived within the state. And today, African Americans make up just barely 2% of the state's population. Native Americans, ethnic Hispanic and Latinos, and even those who identify as two races or more outnumber African Americans. But this doesn't mean the history doesn't matter. In popular representations of South Dakota's history, certain words or phrases frequently come to mind: pioneers, settlers, cowboys, old-fashioned values. And it's not that these words don't describe the experiences of at least some of the people who live here, but there are other terms that should be a part of our vocabulary: colonization, indigenous, the Great Migration, empire, segregation, enslavement. These terms are part of this state's history too. And there is broad, expansive, truth-telling potential in examining the history of Black people in this state. South Dakota is not insular or cut off from the world, but instead it is part of an extensive national and international circulation of people, goods, and ideas throughout space and time. We must think bigger. Chimamanda Adichie warns us of the danger of the single story. The stories that we tell and how often we tell them matter. If a group of people are represented in only one way, or if we only hear one story, it not only results in a simplistic understanding of our circumstances, but more importantly, it robs those people of their dignity. If we challenge ourselves to start in a different place, we will end with a different story. It was the danger of the single story that led, in 1926, that led Dr. Carter G. Woodson to create Negro History Week, which would eventually become Black History Month. His mission, he said, was to emphasize not Negro history, but the Negro in history. Dr. Woodson believed that the root causes of the mistreatment of African Americans were the lies, myths, and stereotypes that were spread about the character of Black people. He engaged in studying the lives of African Americans, not just for the sake of the history itself, but because he believed this was the way to improve the lives of Black people and to teach them love and pride of self. The danger of the single story also led many African American women, early Black feminists, to insist upon telling their own stories to combat misrepresentation. In 1892, Dr. Anna Julia Cooper said, "Only the Black woman can say when and where I enter. In the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood, without violence, without suing, without patronage, then and there the whole Negro race enters with me." We shouldn't care about representation for its own sake. Representation has always been both a reflection and a function of power. The stories we tell, the images we evoke, tell us about our relationships to one another. So what do you know about Black history in South Dakota? What questions have you asked? A talk like this can only begin to scratch the surface. And at the South Dakota African American History Museum, we work to highlight the many professional and amateur historians, artists, and family records keepers who are endeavoring to preserve this history and to inform our understanding of South Dakota history. If we ask questions about Black people in South Dakota, we will end with a different story. York. The African American presence in this region dates back to well before the establishment of the Dakota Territory. York, the slave of William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition, became the first documented African American to travel to this region in 1804. He was by no means the first person of African descent or the first slave to travel across the continent. But the voluminous records kept by the two captains, as well as stories from indigenous oral traditions, means that we have an extensive record for understanding York's experiences. York's mother and father were owned by William Clark's family, and York was designated as a companion and manservant for William Clark from childhood. Scholar Daryl Milner has argued that representations of York throughout time have fallen into one of two categories. He's either represented as Sambo, the dancing, smiling, docile slave, or he's represented as a superhuman colossus, able to leap rivers in a single bound. The reality of his life, of course, was much more complicated. A closer reading of the historical record reveals an increasingly hostile and quarrelsome relationship between York and his owner, Clark. The primary point of contention? York's family, a wife, whom York was unable to be with because of his servitude. Clark's response to York's demands to control the circumstances of his life were to continually threaten to sell him to the Deep South, a virtual death sentence for enslaved people, especially in the early 19th century. When other men from the Lewis and Clark expedition returned to great fortune and fame following their overland journey, York returned to at least another decade of servitude in a bitter and contentious relationship with Clark. York's story also highlights the common ground between enslaved and indigenous people, the theft and plunder of indigenous lands on this continent and in this region, and the theft and plunder of African people from their ancestral homelands unites the histories of indigenous and African descendant people. When we strip away the myths surrounding York, myths about his strength, his skills, his prowess, his life elucidates the incessant exploitation that made exploration and empire possible. The Northwestern Homestead Movement, the Blairs. In 1862, the Dakota territorial government had attempted to ban people of color from entering the territory. Free education and voting was restricted to white male citizens in this region until 1868. Many African Americans, however, migrated to South Dakota in the late 19th and early 20th century in hopes of creating entirely Black colonies. In 1882, African Americans began moving to Sully County in central South Dakota, north of Pierre. Two brothers, Benjamin and Patrick Blair, arrived from Illinois to find land from their family. In 1883, the family filed claims in Fairbank. Their father, Norval Blair, joined them a year later. In doing so, the Blairs became the first residents of what would later become the Sully County Color Colony. Over time, this movement that they dubbed the Northwestern Homestead Movement included over 5,000 acres of land. While many associate Norval Blair with the success of the colony, it was really his daughter, Betty, who was mainly responsible for recruiting Black families from the South to live in the colony. During the time of this movement, the population of African Americans in South Dakota climbed over 500. 200 alone were located within the Sully County settlement. Efforts were made to create other colonies throughout the state. Yankton is one example, but none reached the level of success of the Sully County settlement. The schoolhouse for this settlement still stands to this day on private property. This was a time when African Americans all over the country were leaving southern towns and cities to create vibrant communities throughout the upper and lower Midwest. Communities like Deerfield in Colorado, DeWitt in Nebraska, Nicodemus in Kansas, and Blackdom in New Mexico. The economic downturn of the Great Depression caused people to leave for financial opportunities elsewhere. But imagine, for a time, African Americans from Illinois, Mississippi, Kansas, Arkansas came to South Dakota to search for better treatment and opportunities than what they experienced in the rest of the country. What they found was not perfect, but they found autonomy. Oscar Micheaux. Micheaux was a trailblazer of the genre of films in early 20th century known as race films. Born in Illinois, Micheaux worked briefly as a Pullman porter before moving to Gregory County in South Dakota and purchasing nearly 500 acres of land near the Rosebud Reservation in 1905. He wrote several books about his experiences as a homesteader and developed his own publishing imprint. Micheaux's 1917 novel, The Homesteader, was eventually produced as a full-length feature film, the first written, produced, and directed by an African American for African American audiences. His films were meant to show a realistic portrayal of Black life in the United States that dealt with issues such as interracial relationships, lynching, the rape of Black women, and other Black experiences that were often ignored. Micheaux challenged representations of African Americans during a time of tremendous turmoil for Black people. He helped audiences understand that the histories of slavery and freedom were not just Southern stories, and that the Midwest served as a backdrop for the most pressing issues for Black people. Cleveland Abbott. One of Yankton's greatest sons, Cleveland Abbott was born in Yankton in 1894. He attended high school in Watertown and college at South Dakota State University, where he excelled in basketball and track and field. The SDSU president recommended Abbott to Booker T. Washington, who was leading Tuskegee Institute, a historically black college and university in Alabama. He was hired at Tuskegee in 1916 to help establish a sports program. After serving in World War I and attending graduate school, he returned to Tuskegee, where he remained for over 30 years. Before being inducted into the South Dakota Hall of Fame in 2018, Abbott was recognized for his contributions by the Alabama Sports Hall of Fame, the United States Track and Field Hall of Fame, and the South Dakota State University Hall of Fame. Abbott is remembered as a great coach and architect of the Tuskegee athletics program and as a major influence on the development of collegiate women's sports. After his death, his body was buried at the Tuskegee University Cemetery. During his induction ceremony into the South Dakota Hall of Fame, Bruce Danielson, a local historian of Abbott, whose work is also featured in the South Dakota African American History Museum, remarked, "Booker T. Washington's search for a principled person to build a structured athletic program for students succeeded. Cleveland Abbott was the principled student, teacher, and coach who brought South Dakota values to a national and worldwide stage. To students, he was the Duke of Dakota." Martin Luther King Jr.'s visit to South Dakota. Many people are surprised to learn that Martin Luther King Jr. visited Sioux Falls in January of 1961. But he did, and it was his first and only visit to the state. He was invited to speak to the Knife and Fork Club, and he had previously visited the northeastern United States and was traveling to Los Angeles immediately following his visit to South Dakota. After the success of the Montgomery bus boycott, King was a nationally and internationally known figure. He came to share the philosophy of nonviolence and to garner support for the civil rights movements, the civil rights campaigns in the South. He spoke at the Sheraton Cataract Hotel in downtown Sioux Falls, where Wells Fargo is currently located. Segregation laws and local custom allowed him to speak at the Sheraton Cataract, but did not allow him to spend the night there. And so he spent the evening with a family from St. John Baptist Church, an African American church here in Sioux Falls. Local resident Emma Armstrong, a Georgia native, and a woman often called the mother of Sioux Falls, she recently passed away at 103 years old, played a pivotal role in arranging his visit. In all of the work that Dr. King had to accomplish, he saw the value of engaging with and speaking on behalf of the Black communities here. Most Americans have not been taught to see or embrace African American history as part of their history as Americans. This has consequences for how we tell stories on both a national and regional scale, how we see ourselves both as Americans and as South Dakotans. Assuming that we know all there is to know about those around us hinders our ability to engage in the profound understanding and respect that is necessary for creating a just and inclusive community. So I have a couple of takeaways. Look to the past. Be willing to learn more from the past. We will not find all of the answers there, but we must engage in deeper reflection and engagement with our history. Without it, there is no foundation for progress. We need history to make sense of the world around us. The conflicts we see daily have played out throughout time, and the imperatives for Black people have changed very little. Demands for representation, the right to determine the circumstances of your own life, the right to live free from violence. History provides clarity and vision of where we have been and where we have left to go. Be willing to fully embrace the lessons and support immediate change whenever necessary. Look to the past to be mindful in the present. African American history in this state is not unknown, it is not hidden or invisible, it is readily available. We are all responsible for bringing this history to light. Ask different questions, and you may end up with a different story. This history belongs to all of us. Thank you.